In 1973 Sicily, the moment a man can silence an entire room without uttering a single word, you know you're in the presence of true power. The packed concert hall thrummed with anticipation as Led Zeppelin prepared to take the stage. But that electric energy suddenly transformed into something darker, something suffocating. The crowd's excited chatter died mid-sentence as a notorious Mafia boss strode through the center aisle, flanked by 6 stone-faced men in immaculate suits. Their very presence seemed to drain the oxygen from the Baroque theater. The Don settled into his front-row seat with the casual confidence of a king claiming his throne, while his entourage positioned themselves like sentinels on either side. Venue staff, who moments before had been laughing and joking, now moved with rigid, mechanical precision, their eyes downcast, their hands trembling as they adjusted equipment that didn't need adjusting. Local promoters huddled in the wings, their faces pale as ghosts, exchanging knowing glances that spoke of fear older than memory. The ornate chandeliers above seemed to dim despite their constant glow, as if even the light itself recognized the shift in power. Backstage, roadies who had seen everything from riots to stadium crushes suddenly found reasons to stay busy, to avoid looking toward the audience. The temperature hadn't changed, but everyone felt the chill that crept through the historic venue. This wasn't just another rock concert anymore. It had become something far more dangerous, a collision between 2 worlds that should never meet. The whispers began like poison spreading through water, reaching Jimmy Page's ears as he tuned his guitar in the cramped dressing room. Local stagehand, his voice barely audible above the trembling in his throat, spoke of the Don's terrible reputation, how he considered every performance in Sicily his personal property, demanding tributes that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with submission. Artists who declined his requests simply vanished from Italian tour schedules, their promoters suddenly unreachable, their contracts mysteriously cancelled. The guitarist's fingers paused on the strings as another promoter, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening, recounted the story of an American jazz musician who'd refused to play the Don's mother's favorite song. That performer's instruments were destroyed, his hotel room ransacked, and he fled the country on the next available flight, never to return to European soil. The message was always clear: in this territory, artistic freedom existed only with permission. Jimmy's bandmates exchanged tense glances as the weight of these stories settled over them like a shroud. This wasn't about music anymore. It was about whether they would bend their knees to a power that measured worth in fear rather than art. The legendary guitarist, known for his innovative technique and unwavering vision, now faced a test that had nothing to do with technical mastery and everything to do with the strength of his spine. Through the dressing room walls, they could hear the restless audience, unaware that tonight's performance would become either a surrender or a statement that would echo through rock history forever. The stage lights burned like interrogation lamps as Jimmy Page moved through the hypnotic middle section of Dazed and Confused, his violin bow drawing otherworldly sounds from his Gibson. A figure emerged from the wings, one of the Don's men, his expensive suit unable to disguise the predator's walk, carrying a folded piece of paper like a royal decree. The roadie who received it looked as though he'd been handed a live grenade, his hands shaking as he approached Jimmy between verses. The note extended like an offering to an angry god. Jimmy's fingers never stopped moving as he unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words written in elegant script, a demand disguised as a request for a traditional Sicilian melody, a tribute that would demonstrate proper respect. The choice was poison dressed as courtesy, comply and become another act, who bowed, refuse and face consequences that had destroyed careers before his. Below, the Don sat motionless, his men's jackets hanging open just enough to display the weapons at their hips, a visual promise of what disobedience might cost. The guitarist's jaw tightened something primal and defiant igniting behind his eyes. Without a word, without even a nod of acknowledgement, he crumpled the note in his fist and let it fall to the stage floor. His fingers found the fretboard with renewed fury, launching into a solo that felt less like music and more like a declaration of war. Each note a refusal, each bend a challenge. The amplifiers screaming his answer louder than words ever could. The band recognized the moment instantly, that invisible line being crossed that separates performers from legends. They followed Jimmy into the storm he'd created, transforming their instruments into weapons of pure sonic rebellion that rattled the chandeliers and seemed to crack the very air itself. The crumpled note lay at Jimmy's feet like a conquered flag as his fingers transformed into instruments of pure defiance. Every technique he'd mastered in smoky London clubs, every riff born from blues legends and occult studies, every ounce of his artistic soul poured through that Gibson in waves of sonic fury that seemed to physically push against the audience. His eyes never left the Don's table, each screaming bend and hammer on a message written in the only language he truly spoke, one that recognized no borders, no threats, no masters except the music itself. The violin bow returned to the strings, but now it sounded like weapons being sharpened, like ancient battles being waged through amplification and electricity. Sweat dripped from Jimmy's hair onto the fretboard as he pushed his instrument beyond conventional limits, creating sounds that shouldn't exist, howls and whispers, thunder and silk, all woven into a tapestry that told the Mafia boss exactly what this guitarist thought of his request. The other band members fed off his energy, Robert Plant's voice rising like a war cry, Bonham's drums becoming earthquake tremors of solidarity. Every person in that concert hall understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment where art refused to kneel before power. The locals who'd lived under the Don's shadow their entire lives felt something stir in their chests, recognition of what dignity looked like when it stood its ground. Jimmy's solo stretched beyond music into pure statement, his fingers bleeding defiance into every note, proving that some spirits cannot be purchased, threatened, or broken. John Paul Jones's bass became a seismic force beneath Jimmy's fury, each note a foundation stone for rebellion that resonated through every chest cavity. In the hall, the keyboards swirled like storm systems around the guitar's lightning strikes, creating atmospheric pressure that made ears pop and hearts race faster. Robert's voice transcended melody, becoming pure primal expression that spoke for every artist who'd ever been told to bow, to compromise, to surrender their vision to someone else's. A will. Together, they constructed a cathedral of sound where only one doctrine existed: absolute creative freedom. The venue's ancient walls absorbed decades of performances, but nothing like this communion of defiance. Chandeliers trembled overhead as Bonham's cymbals crashed like bronze declarations of war, his kick drum heartbeat matching the collective pulse of an audience, transformed from spectators into witnesses. The band locked into telepathic unity, each member instinctively understanding that this transcended entertainment. They were drawing a line that would define them forever. Jimmy's fingers moved so fast they blurred, yet every note landed with surgical precision, each phrase building upon the last into an unassailable argument. The local musicians in the crowd felt tears streaming down their faces, recognizing salvation in amplified form. This wasn't just Led Zeppelin performing. This was art itself, standing trial and refusing to plead guilty. The sound became so immense it seemed to erase the room's dimensions, creating a universe where only courage and conviction mattered. In that endless moment, Jimmy Page wasn't simply playing guitar. He was rewriting the rules about who holds power when truth has a voice. The Don's chair scraped against ancient stone as he rose, his massive frame unfolding like a dark prophecy made flesh. His right hand, moved with deliberate slowness toward the inside of his tailored jacket, every eye in the venue tracking that motion as if watching a fuse burn toward dynamite. Time stretched into something viscous and terrible. Bonham's drumsticks hovered mid-air, Robert's microphone hung forgotten at his side, roadies backstage gripped whatever objects they could weaponize. But Jimmy's fingers never stopped, his guitar continuing to scream defiance even as potential death stood upright 20 feet away. The bodyguards flanking the Mafia boss tensed like coiled serpents, their jackets falling open to reveal the instruments of their true trade. Audience members in the back rows began edging toward exits, while those trapped near the front sat paralyzed, caught between legend being born and tragedy unfolding. The air itself seemed to crystallize, every molecule waiting for permission to move again. Security personnel pressed against the walls, calculated impossible odds, knowing their presence meant nothing against men who answered only to blood and tradition. Jimmy's gaze never wavered from the Don's face, reading the storm playing across those weathered features, anger, calculation, something deeper stirring beneath. His solo reached frequencies that seemed to pierce dimensions, notes bending reality itself around the confrontation. The guitar became an extension of his very soul, speaking truths that couldn't be threatened or negotiated. In that suspended breath, rock and roll itself stood trial. Then the Don's hand emerged holding nothing but air, fingers spreading wide as his expression transformed into something unexpected and profound. The Don's hand rose higher, palm open like a man surrendering to something greater than violence, and then he brought those weathered fingers together in a single, resonant clap. The sound cracked through the tension like thunder breaking a drought, and then another clap followed, then another, building into applause that echoed off centuries-old walls. His face had transformed completely, the fury melting into something almost radiant, a recognition passing through his eyes as if he were watching his younger self standing on that stage, refusing to bend. His men stood frozen in confusion, hands still hovering near concealed weapons, glancing between their boss and the guitarist who continued playing with the intensity of a man who had already accepted whatever came. Next, the Don shook his head slowly at his soldiers, a gesture that made holsters close and jackets straighten. Then turned back to Jimmy with both hands now applauding in full rhythm. Other audience members, reading the shift like sailors reading wind changes, began joining the ovation cautiously at first, then with growing fervor. Jimmy's solo began its descent from the stratosphere, notes still powerful but no longer defensive, transforming into something triumphant and uncompromising. Bonham's drums rejoined like war drums, celebrating victory without surrender, and Robert's voice soared back into the mix with primal force. The band completed the song not in submission, but in vindication, proving that art could stand its ground against any empire built on fear. The Don remained standing through the final chord, his applause never wavering, his smile carrying both sadness and pride, the expression of a man recognizing the rarest commodity in his world, a spine that would not break. The dressing room door opened with deliberate slowness, and the Don entered alone, his enormous frame filling the threshold as cigarette smoke curled around exposed light bulbs overhead. Jimmy stood by the mirror, still holding his guitar, sweat drying on his skin, refusing to set down the instrument that had been both weapon and shield. The older man's eyes found Jimmy's reflection, first holding it for a long moment before speaking in accented English that carried the weight of Sicilian stone. "My father, he tell me when I am young, true power, it never begs, never bends, only stands." He moved closer, pulling a worn photograph from his jacket pocket, with hands that had clearly built empires through force, yet now trembled, slightly with something closer to grief. The faded image showed a teenage boy holding a violin, eyes bright with dreams that would never materialize beyond that frozen moment. "My son, he play beautiful, but I teach him wrong things. I teach him everything has price, everyone can be owned. His voice cracked on the final word. Decades of regret, compressing into that single syllable. Tonight, I send you that note because I need to know if artists still exist who remember what my boy forgot before the sickness take him. The Don's palm pressed against his chest, over his heart, the gesture replacing words that wouldn't come. Jimmy finally set down his guitar, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. Two men who'd both discovered that some things, music, integrity, memory, transcend every threat. You play like man who knows some things more valuable than breathing, the Don continued, extending his hand not in dominance but in recognition. Jimmy grasped it firmly, feeling the calloused strength of someone who'd finally found the answer to a question that had haunted him through countless sleepless nights. The handshake lasted longer than custom demanded, sealing an understanding that would ripple through rock history as the night Jimmy Page taught a Mafia boss that true power protects art rather than possessing it. The Don's weathered hands remained clasped around Jimmy's, but his eyes drifted toward the ceiling as if addressing ghosts only he could see. I spent 3 years after my boy dies looking for something, anything, that remind me of his fire before I corrupt it with my world, he whispered, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd searched through darkness without hope. Around them, the dressing room seemed to shrink into intimacy, the distant sounds of the venue closing down, fading into irrelevance as this confession poured forth. Jimmy felt the guitar calluses on the older man's palm, recognition that suffering leaves its marks on everyone, regardless of empire or stage. Tonight, when you look at me with those eyes full of refusal, I see my son before I teach him fear, disguised as respect, the Don continued, finally releasing Jimmy's hand to gesture at the guitar resting against the wall. His movements carried theatrical weight born from Sicilian blood, every gesture a statement carved from volcanic stone and Mediterranean salt. The photograph of his son remained visible in his other palm, crumpled from years of being carried close to his heart, a talisman of irreversible mistakes. Jimmy understood then that this test had never been about power. It had been about redemption, about finding proof that art could still exist, untainted by compromise. The Don straightened his jacket, composing himself with visible effort, transforming back into the figure whose reputation preceded him through these streets. You give me answer I need. Some spirits cannot be bought, cannot be broken, only honored, he declared, his voice regaining its commanding resonance that had built an empire on unwavering conviction. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold exactly as he'd entered, framed by light and shadow in perfect balance. Before departing, he turned back with eyes that had witnessed both creation and destruction. My son, he would have loved your courage. That moment crystallized into legend before the door even closed, the story spreading through Sicily's cobblestone whispers, and eventually across every continent where music mattered more than survival. Jimmy stood alone in the empty dressing room, understanding he'd participated in something beyond performance, a transaction of souls where integrity had purchased redemption. The guitar against the wall seemed to gleam with new significance, no longer just wood and wire, but a testimony that art remains humanity's final, uncorrupted territory. Outside, the Sicilian night embraced secrets old and new, adding this chapter to its eternal collection of stories where courage redefined power itself. The story escaped that dressing room like wildfire through dry Sicilian hills, carried first by roadies and venue staff who'd witnessed history disguised as confrontation, then spreading through every music journal and backstage conversation across continents. Within months, young guitarists from London to Tokyo invoked Jimmy's name, not just for his technical mastery, but for that single moment when 6 strings became a declaration of independence against forces that claimed ownership of creativity itself. The tale transformed with each telling, yet retained its essential truth that art draws power not from accommodation, but from the courage to remain uncompromised even when violence shadows the stage. Record executives and mob bosses alike learned that night that some spirits recognize only one authority, the integrity burning within their own chest. Decades later, musicians facing pressure to dilute their vision would remember Sicily, drawing strength from Jimmy's refusal as if his defiance had created a template for artistic survival. The Don's son, frozen forever in that crumpled photograph, became an unlikely patron saint of authenticity. His memory preserved not through empire, but through the courage his father finally recognized in a British guitarist's eyes. What began as potential tragedy crystallized into mythology, proving that power's truest form isn't domination, but the ability to stand unmoved before it. The Sicilian night that witnessed their exchange continues whispering its lesson through generations, that real legacy isn't what you force into submission, but what you inspire through unshakable conviction. The guitar that nearly sparked violence instead became instrumental in redefining what strength meant, its strings vibrating with frequencies that transcended music into philosophy. Jimmy Page walked out of that venue carrying more than equipment. He carried proof that creativity remains humanity's last unconquerable territory, defended not with weapons, but with the simple, devastating act of refusal. Every artist who followed found their backbone strengthened by his example, understanding that audiences remember compromise with disappointment, but honor, courage with immortality. The Don found his redemption, Jimmy secured his legend, and music itself gained a new scripture written in defiance and respect. That night in 1973, Sicily didn't just create a story, it forged a covenant between art and integrity that no threat could sever, no fortune could purchase, no time could diminish. The packed concert hall emptied into history, but its lesson echoes still through every venue where artists face the choice between compromise and conviction, where Jimmy's ghost stands beside them, whispering the only truth that matters: your art bows to no one. The Don's slow smile and final benediction transformed into every generation's permission to remain unbroken, to recognize that true power isn't given or taken, but simply lived through unwavering presence. Sicily kept their secret just long enough for it to become eternal. What would you have done facing that moment under the stage lights? Subscribe to discover more stories where courage rewrites destiny.